much do you think this is a failure? How much do you think this is a success for the Trump administration? According to them, it's totally a start. He was there.
Yes, well, we are used to President Trump saying that he is a success wherever he goes and with whatever he does, but as we know, that's not always the case. As a former Obama-appointed advisor, I, of course, was devastated when the Trump administration announced that they would not be abiding by the Paris Climate Accord. However, I have so much faith in the resilience of the American system, and I think a perfect example of how our system of federalism and checks and balances work is that the individual states within the United States and many cities and many mayors and governors have decided to abide by the agreement independent of the Trump administration. For example, Governor David Ige from Hawaii has signed onto the agreement.
Right, we all understand that also the New York governor was there as well, but that was quite a controversy in New York State because some have been accusing him not doing his work back at home, rather going out and traveling around. But that's another story. Let me go to you, Mr. Gros, about that. What do you think? We talked about this earlier, before the G20 Summit began. And I do want to have your reflections now, after it comes to an end. Is this going to be a dividing time in which we are going to have more realization of who is likely to be, quote, the leader or the leaders of the free world for the future?
Yes, Hamburg could very well mark the beginning of a period when the free world no longer has a clear leader. Mr. Trump will certainly declare everything he says as a success. And for his own audience at home, it's actually good if he's isolated, because he can say, I stood up for America, I was alone defending our interests. So that plays well for his audience, doesn't play well, I think, for the long-term interests of the United States. And it doesn't play well for the interests of the world. But what we have also seen in Hamburg is that there's nobody else who can really substitute the United States. Angela Merkel tried to put everybody else together, but she knows the limits of German and European power. And she said, all I could do is try to bring some other leaders together, but without the United States, it's not the same thing.
Having said that, though, Mr. Ye, here in Beijing, we see a lot of alternative choices countries are making, even during and right before the G20 summit. For example, about trade. You got Canada, the EU try to come up with a free trade agreement. Japan and the EU come up with their own as well. China and the EU, of course, long time have already got some free trade agreement going on over there. So are we seeing, at least beginning from trade and economics, that this is ever going to be much more multipolarized? And where do you think the United States is going to fit in among all of these changes?
Firstly, about the globalization process, I think we should admit there's a major problem because of the Americans' reluctant attitude towards that. All the bilateral arrangement between Canada and Europe, even between China and Europe, I think we can call them as a useful additional compartment, but it's not a decisive function. It's not a decisive part. For the world, if we want to maintain the current mainstream of the globalization and free trade, free market, I think America still is a necessary part. And
it is very important.
Yeah, and it's almost decisive. And for currently, we see is some comment said that Donald Trump was isolated by another G19. But my question is that at least it indicates that till now, Americans still hold on this current administration stance on a lot of the key issues. So it will be very difficult. I don't think Donald Trump will really care about be isolated. Actually, he will take this chance or moment to show how he's strong.
Of course, there's it could be, you know, in a way being baked on both sides. You could say this way or being portrayed when it comes to rhetoric the other way around. But let me go to you, Ms. Alghussein, to push a little bit further on that. What are we seeing right now? Are we seeing America first, as this administration claiming, or America alone? Even though we got two administration officials wrote this well-known Wall Street Journal op-ed, and yet people are still questioning about that even after the wrapping up of the G20?
Well, I think the premise of the Trump doctrine, America First, is really a false dichotomy. I mean, President Obama was one who championed diplomacy and cooperation and used that as a mechanism to advance American interests. And so I think to assume that the two are in conflict by cooperating with other countries is somehow putting America's interests second is a false start to begin with. In terms of what came out of the G20 summit, I think we still see a lot of opaqueness when it comes to the Trump administration policy and trade. For example, there's a provision called 232, which is a national security provision that the Trump administration has invoked to study the impacts of the imports of aluminum and steel in the United States and might potentially impose some restrictions on those two imports. That is still left undecided. However, we do know that the Brazilians and the EU are in the process of potentially preparing retaliatory measures if in fact the Trump administration decides to impose restrictions on these two imports, which would be devastating, I think, for our trade relations with two former and hopefully future allies.
Ms. Alghussein, since you talk about this possible legislation or proposal policy coming from Trump administration, it is debated also in the United States fiercely. It is realized also in Washington that countries like Canada, like Japan, like some of the European countries are going to be influenced much more than what this possible policy, when it was first raised toward China, claimed. For example, the target is China. So what do you think might be the result of this, and how is this example or case study likely to reflect us about what exactly is going on in the trade policy decision making in Washington right now?
Well, I am hopeful that Trump's rhetoric continues to kind of outsize his actual policy influence. So even though I think his rhetoric towards, a trade is very abrasive, I'm not sure how much traction he's actually going to get on advancing some of his policy agenda if he were to attempt to actually go forward with that. I mean, we even see that in domestic policy. He promised that he would repeal and replace Obamacare within the first 100 days, and just as early as this morning, it sounds like that's falling apart in the Senate. And so I'm actually hopeful that his attempt to undermine our trade in that space will not be effective.
I see. Mr. Gros, besides the leadership issue, there's also another bilateral meeting during the G20 summit that has attracted enormous attention. Of course, that is between the presidents of the United States and of Russia. Ceasefire in Syria has been announced between the two. Meanwhile, President Trump in his Twitter firstly talked about this so-called cyber security team regarding the elections in the US. Later he scrapped off and saying, I'm not saying that's likely to happen. But anyway, he's claiming it a success. Coming from the European perspective, particularly the European Union perspective, what do you make of it?
In a sense, it's a relief, because when Trump first won the election, people thought now he's really going to make an alliance with Putin, and Europe will be squeezed between the two. And we see that is not about to happen. So in that sense, Europe can be a bit more relaxed about it. About the ceasefire in Syria, it's news to me and to many people that actually there was a fight between Russia and the US in Syria. There were some local factions who are fighting. It will probably continue to fight. So I don't think that is an important development. More important is what actually the foreign minister of the United States has said, which is that sanctions will continue as long as Russia occupies part of Ukraine. And that is actually the key substance on which Europe always has insisted. And that seems to have been taken over, not by Mr. Trump personally, but at least by his senior people.
I see. Yes, you do see some difference when it comes to rhetorics between Mr. Trump and his team. Let me go to you once again, Mr. Alghussein, Ms. Alghussein, about this. The election in the United States, I guess that's also what you care about a lot as a Democrat. This time, we see Trump suggested he pressed twice hard toward President Putin about exactly what Russia did. But then right after G20 revealed in the media, his son, Donald Trump Jr. was in touch with a, quote, Russian lawyer about, quote, negative information about the Hillary Clinton before the general election. So how should we make of all of these mixed messages? Where do you think the wind in Washington is blowing right now?
Well, in general, I think that the Trump administration's messaging on Russia has been an absolute disaster. It's a total mess. It seems like nobody coordinates with each other before, one person releases a statement. I mean, when I read Donald Trump Jr.'s press release, I mean, to me, it was a blatant admittance to meeting with a Kremlin-related official to collude on a way to undermine the Hillary Clinton campaign. And then the meeting concluded essentially because that wasn't actually what was happening in the meeting. And so the intent to collude is, I mean, he admitted to that in his statement, which is just shocking. And then at the same time, the White House just continues to deny that anything happened at all. But I mean, I personally think where there's this much smoke, there has to be some fire.
Well, the fire, how big is likely to be the fire, and how is that fire likely to, in a way, influence the atmosphere in Washington? Have things done, Mr. Ye?
Actually, I think I really, really like the word that our European friend used as relief, because the Putin and the Trump meet. It's a very long time, and it indicates how the world care about these two countries, two big giants relationship. But we should notice that the two key issues, none of them is really related to the Syria case. It's all about the Ukraine and all about the Americans' accusation for the Russians sabotage the American election. These two issues, none of them will be touched, and there are two governments' stance. It won't be changed. So I'm not so pessimistic to see that the things will be happen very soon. Actually, in my understanding, these two countries' relationship between Russia and America will maintain the downward tendency. We won't see the miracle.
Okay. Well, another thing about the G20, if we go through the list of importance, is what happened between China and the United States. The two have a bilateral, even though it is not that long as they did in Mar-a-Lago, but certainly got their key messages exchanged. Coming out, Mr. Ye, President Trump was suggesting, well, he understands now that it might take longer than what he expected, I mean, to resolve the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. How does the Chinese side read these messages coming from the U.S.?
Firstly, I think that China should notice that America didn't change their policy. They still hope China will put more pressure on the DPRK to solve the problem. Secondly, I think China should also feel a little bit relief that America understand that they take a long time. So in my understanding, it's only some slightly change. It's not an attitude change, not policy change. It's only the voice change. So I think in the future, China and America has a lot of things need to be discussed or need to be bargaining on the DPRK issue. Actually, we should admit that we have the common interest on the DPRK nuclear issue, but we still have a lot of the differences.
But Ms. Alghussein, what exactly do those words coming from President Trump would mean to you? Does it mean that, yes, better communication and understanding between China and the United States now about the Korean Peninsula issue, how to resolve it, and the time frame is likely to be resolved? Or does it mean that probably both sides have lost faith and confidence in each other about having an immediate common goal and reach it as soon as possible? What does it really mean?
Well, just from reading President Trump's tweets, I do think that he has lost some confidence in the ability to have a better relationship.
But the thing
with
is,
China.
do you trust these tweets?
That's a very good point that you raise. Oftentimes he tweets something and then the policy ends up being completely the opposite.
That's part of his strategy, some suggest, yes.
But I am hopeful that China will, China really has a unique relationship with North Korea, and I am hopeful that Chinese leadership will take advantage of this relationship to decrease the threat, the national security threat, not only to the United States, but to all of Asia, to all of the world, really, for North Korea to have a nuclear weapon and the capabilities to deliver that weapon intercontinentally. And so we do need Chinese leadership there, and we do need Chinese help there, and I think that's an opportunity for China to really step up to the plate and demonstrate their leadership in the world.
Well, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, there has been a very clear difference. One is, quote, strategic patience, namely doing not much. The other is about pressing hard on finding a solution. Mr. Ye, what exactly it means to China, though, from now on? There has been debate now going on in Washington, if we could even look at it through the media. Washington begins to talk about, both parties, that the United States really now needs to think about the possibilities of having bilateral with North Koreans, or at least in talks in which North Koreans are participating.
Personal opinion, I think the DPRK would like to have the bilateral contact with the American, but I don't think currently American will really make the decision that launch the serious negotiation with the DPRK. Currently, Americans still hope that China will put the pressure on DPRK. Just like you mentioned that Donald Trump's policy towards the DPRK is the iron hand in the iron glove. But question is that they need China to punch DPRK, not the American themselves. So in this case, I think really difficult for China to fully cooperate with the American. We know we have the common interest, but doesn't mean we will follow the instrument from the United States. We have our own interest. And by the way, I would like to point out, on the Korean Peninsula, we're not only facing the threat by the DPRK's nuclear capacity, we're also facing the threat of the THAAD deployed in the South Korea. So I think China's stance will be very complicated, not that simple or the one direction.
Not that simple.
No.
Now, like what you say, and we follow, it's a very different psychology that we're talking about, because we got our own interests. But this is our very fascinating story that we have been covering over the week. Before we go, I want to have one sentence from every one of you. Is this G20, has this G20 changed anything? Are we going to see a turn of concepts, a turn of the world as a result of what's going on? Mr. Gros, let's begin with you.
I think we'll see less cooperation, less common governance in trade, in climate change, and that's not good for the world.
I see. Ms. Alghussein?
I think we will need to continue to see the increased influence and leadership of European powers and other powers in the area of climate. I think trade is still yet to kind of unravel. I don't think anything really definitive came out of the G20, ironically, at least on U.S. trade. Again, you know, we have messages, but we have to see if the policy actually backs that up.
Mr. Ye?
Honestly, we still need G20, but we won't count on that.